I respect your point, and I thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. I do accept the request made by the chair and the Honorable Minister and other members to be brief. But I think the number of issues that have emerged out of my study of both these bills, in my personal opinion, merit the attention of the government. Ultimately, what they do with it is entirely up to the government and the Honorable Minister. But I would, through you, like to mention that it is important that these issues are brought into public knowledge, into public domain. And frankly, I would very much appreciate if the Honorable Minister, if not in his reply today, but at a later stage, at least addresses many of the issues that I'm going to raise. Maybe call me for a cup of tea and tell me where I was right or wrong. In the last 2.5 years, nothing of that sort has happened. And it's my constant complaint that all issues remain unanswered in this House. Sir, my party welcomes this bill. I personally also welcome this bill. It is long awaited. It is a bill which has taken 8 years for this government to bring before us. I feel sorry that this government could hardly do any reform in the first 5-year tenure that they have. I don't know what were the reasons. They obviously complain about coalition compulsions and whatnot have you. But the fact of life is most of these provisions were introduced in 2005. They were necessary provisions. We in fact feel it should have been taken up after the Standing Committee recommendations in 2005 itself. But as they say, Der aaye durust aaye. I am glad that at least today we are sitting late on the last day of this session and clearing both these bills. But of course, it does raise serious questions about what is the seriousness of this government in really carrying out reform. Is reform only a political agenda, or is reform in the interests of the nation? And I think if it was in the interests of the nation, as I believe it is, then the government should have brought it in 2005. They should have taken the bull by the horns, as they say. They could have sought our support and possibly passed it much earlier. Sir, at the outset, I am a little concerned about one aspect of this bill, which we have, the charade that we went through 3 or 4 days ago. This bill was discussed extensively in the Standing Committee. Recommendations were made. And by and large, the government and most political parties, save and except one or two, one member in the Standing Committee had a vote of dissent. But by and large, we were all in agreement on the major provisions of this bill. I don't understand what was the need to surreptitiously bring in a clause to permit forward trading contracts and investments in derivatives or forward contracts in commodities in this bill. I can't understand where the urgency of that bill was, that without even referring it to the Standing Committee, just because possibly some other committee mentioned that this should be considered, what was the reason to bring it into the bill and then try to brazen the way through Lok Sabha and possibly in the future through my house to pass this bill with that clause? It came in that the committee's report on consumer affairs came in December 2011. If at all there was any need, they could have discussed at least with the major parties. It's 12 months back that that report came. We have had discussions on this bill on several occasions, many times in between, but this was never discussed. I would urge the Honorable Minister to consider the seriousness of that particular clause. Even in the US, the Walker Rule, which has recently been introduced on July 21st, 2010, there's a specific section of the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act, Section 619, which clearly states it restricts US banks from making certain kind of speculative investments that do not benefit the consumer, the customer. And Mr. Walker argued that such speculative activity played a key role in the financial crisis of 2007-2010. The Honorable Finance Minister is a very learned person. We all have seen him head this important ministry for many years. But I am interested to know under what pressure or under what circumstances he thought it fit to introduce this provision in this bill, possibly even try to argue that it is necessary in this bill before, under the collective pressure of large sections of the lower house, he had to withdraw that bill. And I'm grateful that he decided to withdraw that bill. Otherwise, like in many other reform measures, we would have seen one more bill go down the path of brazenness. We would have seen one more bill which would never have seen the light of day, just because, I don't know what is the vested interest, but because some people thought it fit to bring that bill, that clause into this bill. If I would in fact urge the Honorable Minister to investigate how this crept in, what was the pressures on the government, because I checked with several bankers, both in the PSU domain and in the private banks domain. They were all amused and they said, we don't want it, we never asked for it. I checked with the chambers of commerce, I checked with people from industry. Everybody was surprised where this came from. So I think it's something which we should investigate, where this clause came from, who prompted it, and if at all, as is the current coin in the political environment, there was some lobbying for this bill. I think we should know more about it. Of course, this brings me to the larger issue of reform. I have been consistently placing my party's position before government, before the public, that BJP and the BJP-led NDA stands for reform. We believe reform has to be calibrated with a human face, and we believe we need to have accelerated reform in public interest. There are several measures of this government which we have supported. They could not have brought the pension bill before the House, but for our support, we have supported FDI in so many other sectors except multi-brand retail, where we have serious concerns and issues regarding the benefit that the common man will get and regarding the negative aspects of that provision. We, of course, have gone through that issue in detail in the House. It is now a part of law and we respect that. But other than 2 or 3 contentious issues, by and large, my party has been pro-reform and we have always extended a hand of constructive support. I only urge the government to take that hand in all fairness, in an atmosphere of mutual trust and in an atmosphere where we can argue and debate the issue and come to a consensus. Sir, while I'm on this, I would like to briefly digress to the issue of pension and insurance bills. So the pension bill was introduced with my party's support in the Lok Sabha. And after that, we don't see anything happening about that bill. That bill was introduced with 26% FDI. Now we are given to understand that this cabinet has decided to increase the FDI to 49% in pension. And we are completely confused as to what is happening. They are bringing in new bills which we are deliberating, but that pension bill remains where it is. And we don't see why that bill was not brought before the House for consideration or reference to the standing committee when the winter session was on. And in that respect, I would like to draw the attention of the House, the Honorable Minister, through you, sir, to a statement by the PFRDA chairperson, Mr. Yogesh Agarwal. I'm quoting from the Business Standard of 11th October, soon after the cabinet approved 49%. His comment was, in terms of foreign fund flows into the country, one should not expect much because the capital requirement is lower than that in insurance. There's a long article, many points in that which are worth considering. But I will just highlight one issue that he brought out. Pension fund managers are only managers of pension fund. They don't require large capital. The requirement of capital for a pension fund manager is only 25 crores. So even if 10 of them were to come in, sir, the total capital required is 250 crores. So whether you make 26 or 49, the additional FDI is going to be only 50, 60 crores. So I don't understand what is the need. And I think today, Indian managers and Indian professionals are teaching the world good business practices, innovative products, reach to the common man. We don't need the foreigners to come in and own our pension funds and to start dictating terms to the large funds before the pension managers. And I think it is absolutely misplaced to try and delay a bill where there has been large consensus across the different parties unnecessarily on that one clause of 26 and 49. Similarly, on insurance, the BJP-led NDA had introduced 49% FDI in insurance when we introduced the reform in insurance 10 years ago. The bill was referred to the standing committee at that point of time chaired by the Congress. The Congress had strong reservations on 49% and they insisted it should be retained at 26%. My leader, Mr. Atal Bihari Vajpayee, was a person who believed in consensus building. He believed in taking all sections of opinion and thought together. And he readily accepted 26%. He said, let's make a beginning and we'll take it forward from there. When this government brought the bill to introduce to 49%, I, for one, can tell you, I went into the thought process very clear that we are going to support 49%. However, when the presentations of the government, of the insurance companies, and certain international interests, again, maybe lobbyists, I don't know what, were made before our committee, we were all amazed at the abysmal low amount of FDI that had come into insurance so far. We were all worried that these provisions to introduce 49% FDI are without any safeguards as to valuation, as to fresh capital flowing in. And we were also quite concerned that the insurance companies had actually brought no great penetration in rural areas and no large investable funds in infrastructure sector as was promised by them. Therefore, the committee in its unanimous wisdom decided that insurance FDI will remain at 26%. I don't know why this government is again making a prestige issue out of it. However, if the government wants to consider 49%, we don't close our minds. My party is always open to new thought processes. And we have indicated in several fora that if the government was to engage in a dialogue, and through that dialogue we could build up a consensus, and they could address our concerns. As I said, I have concerns about valuation of insurance companies. I have concerns about whether fresh capital will actually come into the country through this increased route, or we will only see existing amounts brought in the form of convertible instruments getting converted to 49% in the hands of foreigners, because the insurance valuation right now is as per one RBI discounted cash flow formula, and actually no fresh money will come into the country. Therefore, considering all of these issues, I think the government needs to engage with larger sections of society and public opinion, and then deliberate and decide on this issue. Sir, a couple of things that have come up in the course of our deliberations in the standing committee, I'll just briefly highlight. I won't take much of the time, but the standing committee had mentioned that the government should consider non-voting shares and they should consider differential voting right shares. I will not engage this House in explaining what they are. The Honorable Minister is well versed with it. My concern is that the Ministry of Finance gave us an excuse why they are not considering this, which was not acceptable. They tried to say it would require a change in the basic structure of the Banking Regulation Act. So what? We are in any case amending the Banking Regulation Act. Because the nature of government holding or public sector holding has been defined in terms of shareholding and not voting rights per se. Sir, every law in the country relating to public listed companies or public companies, even the SEBI provisions, always take voting rights and shareholding both. I don't see any great difficulty if we were to bring it in. It would have actually solved the Honorable Finance Minister a lot of his difficulty in providing funds to public sector banks to recapitalize them. They could actually raise large capital without a burden on the exchequer. So now I'll come to the provisions of the bill. We have a provision which is defining associated enterprises. I'm referring to page 6 of the bill. It's clause 10, where not clause 10, I'm sorry, clause 9, where in 29A, subsection 3, an explanation of associated enterprise has been given. The standing committee deliberated a lot on this, and we came to the conclusion that it does not require to be highlighted and explained in such great detail. We should have rather let it be associated enterprise and let the RBI deliberate and decide what it will be. But now they've brought in a definition, sir, and 3 of those clauses are very dangerous. The first is an associated enterprise includes an enterprise which is a holding company or a subsidiary company of the banking company. Subsidiary is okay. Now a holding company of the banking company. So if Tata's were to set up, Tata Sons was to set up a bank, every other, the holding company, that's Tata Sons, could also come under regulation of RBI. I don't understand what is the wisdom of that. Similarly, subclause 3 says, a subsidiary company or a joint venture company of the holding company. Now taking the same example, Tata Sons may have maybe hundreds of subsidiaries. Every company in the Tata group indirectly, directly has some relationship with Tata Sons, and they have a relationship which could come under this clause of subsidiary or joint venture, especially because the management is controlled by that group. So therefore now you'll have RBI regulating the entire space of the Tata group, or having the possibility to regulate it. And the worst is point 6, sir, to obtain economic benefits, able to obtain economic benefits from the activities of the banking company. Sir, even as a shareholder, if I was to become a shareholder of that bank, I would also get economic benefit from the banking company. So indirectly, under this clause, subclause, you could actually bring any and everybody who's a shareholder also of the banking company, and RBI could call for information. So I would urge the finance minister to relook at this. I think this definition could have been avoided, or at least some clarification from the finance ministry may be in good order. I would now come to the one other issue that comes up out of this clause, sir, is in this clause they have written that the Reserve Bank may call for the books of these companies or any other information, as well as they can inspect them jointly with the board or authority regulating such associate enterprise. Again, that's something which has confused me. My first maiden speech in this house, sir, was on the ULIP controversy, where SEBI and IRDA were fighting over control of the ULIP type products that the insurance companies were issuing. Now, that time the Honorable Finance Minister and the government led us to believe that such joint control, which I was proposing between IRDA and ULIP, IRDA and SEBI, is actually harmful, for the system. That is what the government made us to believe. And now here they are bringing in a clause which provides for such joint control. So I don't know what is the position of this government. Do they agree that joint control is good? And if it is so, which they are providing here, then will they revisit that law which was passed in August 2010, in which we brought in the investments of insurance companies, which ideally should be monitored by SEBI. We brought it under the control of IRDA. And the excuse given was joint control is not good. So that was the other issue I thought the government may like to address. So there is one clause in this bill which allows for supersession of board of directors. Sir, I'm in favor of the Reserve Bank of India having authority to supersede board of directors, but I have just 2 or 3 small observations the Honorable Minister may like to consider. We are saying the Reserve Bank may appoint, in consultation with the central government, the administrator for such period as it may determine. Now in another clause we are saying the bank board can only be superseded for 6 months, which may be extended to a maximum of 12 months. So I think here ideally we should say for such period not exceeding 12 months. Similarly, in subclause 5 of clause 10, we are saying the Reserve Bank may constitute, in consultation with central government, a committee of 3 or more persons to assist the administrator. Sir, I had requested the government, and my committee had also discussed this, that it is not good to give unfettered complete powers to one administrator. In the interests of good management practice, instead of may, this clause should read, the Reserve Bank shall constitute, in consultation with central government, a committee of at least 3 or more persons. Shall and at least 3, I think, will make it mandatory on the government that the administrator cannot have unfettered powers, and there will be 3 other persons with domain expertise knowledge to assist the administrator. So one other point that the committee had deliberated and insisted, that no serving or retired officer of the central or state government. So we had said we don't want bureaucrats. As it is, we are finding that in this government, it has become a habit to park bureaucrats where post-retirement in different positions. We had tried to say post-retirement, these people should not be given any jobs in the form of administrator or advisors. They have brought in the clause which says that serving officers will not be brought in, but they have omitted to write retired officers. So I think the government may clarify it in some form that neither serving nor retired officers will be appointed administrators. I think what these banks need is domain knowledge in law, banking, finance, accountancy, and not just somebody who claims to know it all just because he has had a 30-40 years service in the government. Incidentally, one other clause that relates to another law related to this, like you have brought in the law that Reserve Bank may appoint an administrator and supersede the board. There was another law passed 1.5 years ago. That was the State Bank of India Act and the State Bank of India Subsidiaries Act. In both those acts, the government had proposed Reserve Bank may supersede the board and take approval from the central government. Now, at that point, I had also raised this point. You were not the Honorable Finance Minister, sir, at that time. I had said, why should it require approval of the government? Once RBI decides, I had said it should be final. Here they have correctly said in consultation. I can understand consultation, but why approval? So I would urge the Honorable Minister to please look up those 2 laws, the SBI Act and the SBI Subsidiaries Act, and correct those so that instead of approval, they also reflect the status here in consultation with the central government. Sir, there are a few issues related to the banking sector as a whole. The Honorable Finance Minister and the Reserve Bank of India Governor today, it seems, don't see eye to eye at all. It's a matter of concern for all of us. We are concerned with the reports emanating. We believe that is what the reports seem to suggest. And I have a few things I would just like to highlight with reference to that. The Honorable Finance Minister on 29th October unveiled a roadmap for fiscal consolidation. It was a very hyped up press conference. All of us sitting glued to television, waiting to hear the Honorable Finance Minister. But it's a question of Reserve Bank, sir.
No, you continue.
But during that press conference, I think other than promises for the future, I didn't see any roadmap being unveiled. We did hear that 0.6% fiscal deficit will reduce every year. It was a statistical exercise. I went through that old statement many times then and now. And I found that even at that point, the Honorable Minister had acknowledged that 5.1% fiscal deficit looks difficult this year, but 5.3 is doable. While the budget was being presented, I beg to submit, I had told the Finance Minister that what you are saying, 5.1, is impossible. You have not provided for half the expenditure. But they still thought it prudent. My suspicion, sir, is even 5.3 is not doable. The way things are going, the way economy is going, we could land up with 5.7 or 5.8. And we may have a situation where the RBI governor, who refused to accept these promises and did not do any rate cut thereafter on the next day, in the monetary policy will probably be proved right, unfortunately for the nation. Of course, the RBI said the government's fiscal deficit plan unveiled yesterday was short on detail, and they would look for more details, while it stressed the need to contain inflation. So RBI the next day told the world and all of us that we are not happy, we are not satisfied with the government's commitment and statement. We need the government to do more. Thereafter, sir, we had the situation of banking licenses. And, sir, that is why I was raising this issue to lead up to this point. Similarly, on banking licenses, the RBI has consistently held the stand that we will not issue licenses till the government amends this law. The Honorable Finance Minister did make an appeal to the Reserve Bank Governor to start the process with an assurance that this bill will be passed either in this session or the next. But again, unfortunately, the Reserve Bank refused to accept that, and we heard them say that we will wait for you to actually pass the law and we will not do anything till then. Now, all of these are matters of concern for us, sir. I believe the Reserve Bank and government have a very important role to work in tandem and once again spur growth and the investment climate. I think it needs a little bit of introspection on the part of the government and possibly also the Reserve Bank as to how they see the future of this country going forward. Of course, a small thing, on November 15, the Honorable Finance Minister did say housing and automobile sectors are doing well. Infra, steel, construction is under stress, textile and food processing is under stress. I think, Honorable Minister, housing and real estate is also in the doldrums, as you will find from your banks, and the auto sales are drastically falling, at least in this current quarter. Sir, I would like to come at a small point regarding private banks. There is now talk that private banks will be given fresh licenses. And some of the reasons given are that the economy has grown in size, we need to bring in sophistication, we need to extend geographic coverage, and we need to improve access to banking services. Unfortunately, what has been the past experience? 10 licenses were given under 93 guidelines. Some of them are still around, 3 of them are not around now. 2 banks were given license based on the 2001 guidelines in 3 and 4. Now, after all of that, what is the current state of the private sector banks? They have not been able to expand the reach. The percentage 10 years ago, which the PSUs enjoyed in the banking space, is what they enjoyed today also, despite so many new banks coming into the field. So I don't know what these banks have really been able to do in terms of achieving these objectives. However, it's important to note that these banks and the new banks that are going to now come up have largely focused on metro areas, cities and towns, and have really never bothered to reach out to the rural population, as I will come to in a few moments. Sir, in the draft guidelines for new private sector banks, there is mention of fit and proper criteria. I had joined the issue with the Reserve Bank on the fit and proper criteria. I would only urge the Finance Minister to go through it with care, because I find the criteria is very subjective. We need to introduce objectivity into this criteria. And I think aspersions cast on certain sectors of the economy are not good for this country. The guideline says entities, groups that have significant 10% or more income or assets, or both from activities including real estate, construction, and broking activities, shall not be eligible to promote banks. Sir, I think a mother looks at all children equally, and the government and RBI should look at all sectors with an open mind and not with a myopic vision. How can we cast aspersions on Tata Realty, Godrej Realty, companies of repute? Is the government or is the RBI trying to say that a company of the size and scale of operations of DLF is actually a company which is not good enough to hold a banking license, but good enough to borrow $4 billion from the banking system? I think it is not in good taste to exclude certain sections. I'm not holding a brief for specific companies or specific sectors. I disagree with the concept of casting aspersions on any sectors of the economy per se. By that logic, the largest scam in this country has been in the telecom sector. It's been in the mining sector. So shall we now exclude more and more companies? Anybody in telecom? Exclude. Anybody in mining, natural resources, steel, power? Exclude. So what is going to be the criteria? And then the guidelines go on to say that the business model and business culture of such companies in real estate and capital market activities is misaligned with banking. But by that logic, RBI should ban these companies from borrowing from the banking system. And if their integrity is suspect, then I would like to know, sir, that at 9% in the exposure to that sector, their integrity is okay. At 10%, it becomes bad. So if a person is a thief for 9% of the time, he is okay, he's acceptable. And once he crosses the cusp of 10%, he's not acceptable. I think such conditions tend to make a person like me fear that the process of allotting private bank licenses could be influenced, could go through a process which may not be entirely fair. And I say this with authority because the 2003 round had indicated that after 3 or 4 years we'll issue more licenses. There are 10 more applications or 8 more applications still pending before RBI. They have neither been rejected nor considered. Now, I cannot understand how the government or RBI proposes to restrict certain companies and give licenses selectively only to some companies. I think we should follow the American model. There are enough examples internationally where bank licenses are given once the fit and proper criteria is met and a company is eligible for a license, he should get it. You cannot pick and choose between 2 eligible companies and give it to one, because that raises the scare of extraneous considerations before allotment of these licenses. Of course, at that time, some newspaper reports had come whether there should be auction of banking licenses. Obviously, bank licenses are not auctioned anywhere in the world, I think except one country. But more importantly, the issue is the moment you create a scarcity in a commodity and you pick and choose somebody, the other persons could go to court and it could vitiate the entire atmosphere. I would just like to highlight what happens in such a company when you restrict the licenses. The moment 2 or 3 get licenses and 10 don't, there's an unsatiated demand of the others. So what can a person do, a promoter who gets a license? He can invest 500 crores into the banking company. Within 2 years, he has to go public. And as we saw in past experience, whoever got a banking license got a significant premium in the market. He can go to the market within 2 years, which he's bound to do, divest 25% of the company's shares or bring in fresh equity at a huge premium, thereby increasing the market worth of these shares. And since he has to bring it down to 40% within 5 years, he can then sell his shares at a huge profit. So you will have a situation where for zero investment, just because a company has got a banking license, he will be the owner of 40% of a bank, not only with zero investment. I have done an example, I won't read it out, but he could possibly make 300, 400, 500 crores in the bargain. So I think this issue needs to be addressed, and objective criteria, and everybody should get it. Sir, there are concerns about priority sector lending on the private sector banks, and I have data here which I can show the Honorable Minister, which show that the private sector has only 700 rural branches as against 8,066 PSU bank branches in rural areas, which is disproportionate to their deposit and advances. Further, the new private sector banks have a deposit of only 1% from rural India, whereas private sector banks have about 10% of their deposits coming from rural India. Similarly, advances to rural areas in the private sector are less than 0.5% of their total advances, whereas The advances of the government banks are about 8%. I think the burden of rural India, the burden of priority sector is being borne by our public sector banks, and the private banks are only, if I may use a colloquial term in Hindi, malai kha rahe hain. They're only enjoying the fruits of liberalization. They're only coming to metro cities, towns, setting up branches there, and the government has a clause which says 1 out of 4 branches has to be in rural area. It's not a problem at all, sir. A branch in rural India will cost them 50,000 rupees. So they can set up a branch there, and that 50,000 they will look at as a loss leader because it allows them to set 3 branches in more profitable areas. So they'll amortize that 50,000 over the 3 other branches and cross-subsidize their cost. So really, I think this is not good enough a safeguard. We need to also emphasize in terms of volume of business, in terms of reach, these banks will have to increase the scope of their business. Sir, one thing about agriculture lending, which leads me to believe private banks are not doing the job fairly. Delhi has direct agriculture credit of 6,400 crores. It is even more than Orissa, Jharkhand, which are 10 times the size of Delhi. Now, I wonder where in Delhi anybody has found agriculture, and that also direct agriculture lending of 6,400 crores. And the even more interesting statistic is indirect finance to agriculture. Delhi has the highest in the country, 19,200 crores indirect agricultural advances. Now, my personal suspicion is all of these are in some form or the other given to large corporates whose registered office or offices are in Delhi and are being fobbed off under the garb of agricultural advances. And many colleagues in this house have often raised this issue that the farmer is suffering for want of timely credit at good rates, whereas the money is being cornered by certain people and not reaching the final beneficiary. I would urge the government to look into these statistics and give us more insight to the House of where a city like Delhi lands up getting 25,000 crores of agricultural advances. We of course need to seriously reflect how we are going to improve the working, strengthen the public sector banks to face the onslaught of private sector banks. I would in fact compliment them that despite such adverse conditions, they are still holding their own and managing to do a good job. But I think the government needs to also support that. They need to incentivize management, probably consider fixed tenure-based appointments so that people are not in positions for 1.5 years, 2 years. Before even they can make an impact, they have to leave. I hope the asset liability mismatch of the PSU banks is in the notice of the Honorable Minister and the government, because serious concerns are being raised that the PSU banks, who are now the lender of the last resort for project financing with long tenure loans, have a huge asset liability mismatch. I hope the government will look at that issue, possibly expand institutions which can do long-term lending. And finally, I hope they would revamp the boards of these banks and bring in some good, high-caliber professionals to steer and guide the banks into a future of better prosperity. I have, of course, on many occasions raised the issue of the fear of CBI and CVC on the commercial lending decisions of banks. I think, Honorable Minister, you will appreciate that any decision taken at a particular point of time is relevant at that point, and a post facto analysis 10 years later, harassing people who may have even retired from the banks, is something we should dispense with. If at all you want, have a system of an advance ruling or an audit before a loan is dispersed, so that this type of fear psychosis is removed and the banks actually start taking commercial decisions in their fullest. Sir, you have often mentioned about education loans. I heard you in the other house that you are passionate about education loans. In our standing committee, some bankers had come, and we realized, sir, that in South India, largely from where the Honorable Minister hails, there is a huge scam going on in educational loans. Educational institutes, which used to have fees of 1 lakh a year, 1,20,000 a year, realized that the banks give 6 or 7.5 lakhs without security, and they've all uniformly jacked up their fees to the top level of loan without security. And in the process, students are landing with huge liability. And when they graduate from these institutions, they don't even make enough money to repay these loans. So the banks are finding that they're having a large NPA in educational loans of this nature and have actually restricted their loans to education sector for engineering and management colleges. Sir, I have one concern about the misuse of PSU banks, which I'll highlight in 2 or 3 examples. Look at the farm loan waiver scheme of this government in 2008. They have misused public sector banks to give a farm loan waiver for the outstanding with the farmers up to June 2007. So the government gave a waiver and decided to write off 65,000 crores outstanding as on June 2007. The banks were told to write off these loans, give waiver to the farmers because it suited them politically to get that benefit. But at the end of it, they did not reimburse the banks at that time. Banks were reimbursed in installments up to 2011. July 2011, they got the last money. But the government never had to account for it. So the banks had an outstanding entry receivable from the government, but government got the political benefit of it, but never had to provide for it. In this manner, sir, if this government desires, today they can distribute 2,50,000 crores to the people of this country. They can give 10,000 rupees to every family in this country and say, look, vote for us in the next election, here's 10,000 rupees. Tell the banks to distribute that and say, we'll reimburse you if we come back to power in the next 5 years. And if we don't, then the new government will sort out the problem. I think banks should only be allowed to show that accrual in their books due from the government once the government provides for it in their budget, and they cannot get away by providing such shops and not providing for it in their budget.
Now your time is over.
Sir, we have 2 bills, so I have another bill to discuss.
No, what is written here, your time allotted.
So one last point on this. I also urge the government to look at mergers and consolidation in the banking industry a little more seriously, because I find India is ranking 65th .
The problem, pending petitions and petition deciding, the whole thing under the sun. So how much time, sir? 1 hour is over, sir.
No, I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman.
No, you have
I
to
have
allocate
highlighted
time.
the misuse of the PSU banks, and this bill relates to
You
banking.
speak your point.
It is
You
very
speak
important
your
that
point. That the minister can make
Anyway,
1 hour. The minister will, in his reply, he will say, now plus you please conclude. You please conclude. Your time is over.
I have a few comments on the enforcement of security interests
Now we take
and
another
recovery
1
of
2
debt
minutes.
loss bill. Very briefly, I'll raise it, sir. While this bill came in as an ordinance in 2004, there was absolutely no reason to delay it for 7 years, 8 years. They could have easily brought it before the House much earlier. But now when they brought it, there was no reason not to take it to the standing committee. While I have no objection, it's a good bill. We support it fully. But I think we could have given some more suggestions to them to improve on the bill. But a couple of points that I want to raise before them. They have said the
No,
bill
you
will allow
support the bill.
conversion of debt into equity. I would urge them to take care that it is into equity which is not preference shares, because my concern is that banks are giving
Mr.
0%
Goyal, now you
preference
conclude. You
shares
conclude, your time is
against these
over.
loans, and that is money written off, never comes back to the bank. Secondly, the recompense clause is not being used by the banks. When they are enforcing security, they always provide a recompense clause, but defaulters are never paid to pay for their default. I would urge the government to look at that very seriously and force the borrowers who turn around to pay for that.
That's
Last point, sir.
Last point.
They have taken upon themselves the process of settlement, but they have not provided any fast-track mechanism. I would urge the government to look at fast-tracking settlement cases, because settlement tends to drag on for years, and in that process,
Thank you.
the value deteriorates, they lose value, and banks suffer for delays in taking decision, again probably because of the fear psychosis.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and we support both these bills.